Night falls heavy and unmerciful over a small town in northern Arkansas. A mob of white men surges through the dusty streets of Harrison, their torches casting wild, flickering light across the faces of terrified black families. It's late September 1905, and Harrison's black community is under siege. Only hours earlier, a gang of townsmen smashed into the county jail. They dragged out black prisoners, men who had been locked up on petty pretexts, and hauled them to the outskirts of town. There, in a frenzy of hatred, the mob tied the prisoners to trees and lashed them with whips. But whipping a few men wasn't enough to satisfy their fury. They poured into Harrison's black neighborhood next, kicking in doors and yanking families from their beds. Panicked mothers clutch their children while fathers stand helpless, facing gun barrels and snarling threats. Houses are set ablaze one after another. Amid the crackle of fire and the crash of collapsing walls, the white mob delivers its ultimatum. Every African American must leave town tonight. If anyone stays until sunrise, they may not live to see it. In the chaos, entire families flee into the darkness with nothing but the clothes on their backs. An elderly couple huddles in a mule-drawn wagon, a baby crying in the crook of its grandmother's arm as they bounce along a rutted country road away from the inferno that was once their home. Behind them, Harrison burns. The mob, having expelled most of its black neighbors in a single night of terror, feels proud, claiming they've protected their town. By the time dawn breaks, Harrison has effectively rid itself of its entire black community. The message couldn't be clearer. This town belongs to white people only, and any black person who dares remain will face the same terror or worse. This harrowing scene is not a grotesque anomaly. It is part of a pattern that is spreading across America in the early 20th century. That same year, 1905, similar horrors played out elsewhere. In Texas, in Illinois, in Indiana, towns large and small were slamming their doors shut against black Americans with startling ferocity. And it was not confined to the Deep South either. In fact, it was far more prevalent outside of it. On paper, the Reconstruction era after the Civil War had ended slavery and theoretically granted equal rights to black citizens. But by the turn of the 20th century, a vicious backlash had set in. Jim Crow laws in the South stripped away rights, while across the Midwest, Northeast, and West, all white towns sprouted like poisonous mushrooms. If you were black in early 20th century America, there were growing swaths of the map where you were not just unwelcome, you were in grave danger after the sun went down. Now, what if I told you that this history did not simply fade away with time? Sundown towns did not disappear when the signs came down or when the laws changed. Many of them still exist today through reputation, through policing, through housing practices, and through beliefs about who belongs and who does not. Have you ever wondered why some towns today remain overwhelmingly white? It is not by coincidence, but by design inherited from this history. If you look at America today and wonder why segregation still feels baked into the landscape, why entire regions remain racially isolated, and why traveling while black can still feel dangerous in certain places, know that it is all because of legacy. And until that legacy is understood, until the reality of sundown towns is confronted honestly by the public majority, America cannot fully understand itself. Because if you do not understand sundown towns, you do not understand America. Give this video a like if you're ready to learn what sundown towns really are and why their legacy is one of the biggest reasons behind segregation, fear, and exclusion in America today. Now let's continue. By the early 20th century, the grim pattern seen in Harrison was repeating itself in town after town until it became a nationwide scourge. Beginning in the 1890s and continuing into the mid-20th century, white Americans established thousands of these sundown towns, places that proudly proclaimed themselves all white on purpose. Some were created in one explosive burst of violence, like a powder keg ignited by a single spark. In Forsyth County, Georgia in 1912, for example, a white mob lynched a black man accused of abusing a white woman, then went on a rampage to drive out every last black resident of the entire county. More than 1,000 black people fled Forsyth County in a matter of days, abandoning farms and homes. For the rest of the 20th century, Forsyth County remained virtually all white. Its leaders and residents maintained an unwritten vow that no black family would ever again settle there. The same kind of racial purging struck dozens of other communities. In 1909, the twin towns of Anna and Jonesboro in southern Illinois expelled their black residents after a so-called spectacle lynching nearby. Locals later quipped that Anna stood for Ain't No Negroes Allowed, and indeed, for decades afterward, census records showed Anna and Jonesboro with 0 black inhabitants. It was common knowledge that any black traveler passing through those towns should not stop if they valued their life. Sundown towns came in all sizes and existed in every region, but they thrived especially in the Midwest, Plains, and Western states, areas outside the traditional Deep South. In the South, where the legacy of slavery meant black labor was deeply entwined with the economy, whites imposed brutal Jim Crow segregation but generally did not expel all black people. They kept them down but still in town. In much of the rest of the country, however, white communities chose a different approach: keep black people out entirely. By 1930, one could travel through large stretches of the Midwest and find not a single black soul living in town after town, county after county. In Illinois, nearly 3/4 of all towns with over 1,000 people had no black residents listed in the census, a stark indicator of deliberate exclusion. State after state showed a similar pattern. Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Oregon, many communities that once had small black populations saw them vanish. Historians later called this Great Exodus the Great Retreat, as black Americans were forced to retreat from areas they had once lived in across the North and West. During this nadir of race relations between 1890 and the 1930s, at least 50 towns across America drove out their black populations violently. Countless others did so through intimidation or legalistic measures. It was a sweeping, largely unspoken campaign to create whites-only communities from coast to coast. The methods varied. Sometimes it was outright bloodshed and terror. In Pierce City, Missouri, for instance, a white mob in 1901 murdered several black residents and burned black homes, chasing the rest of the black townspeople away overnight. Other times it was city officials quietly crafting ordinances to bar African Americans. A town in Kentucky might pass a law decreeing that no Negro could live within the city limits or even spend the night. Appleton, Wisconsin long had a reputation for an official sundown ordinance. Local lore held that until the 1950s, a black person could not legally reside there. Whether or not every such law was formal, the effect was the same. Police in many towns served as enforcers of the color line, ready to arrest or harass any black stranger after dark on a vagrancy charge. In countless other places, the rules were never written down at all, just communicated by threat and habit. A black traveling salesman or musician might be warned by a friendly white gas station attendant, "You'd better be out of this town by sunset." The penalties for ignoring. Such warnings could range from a brutal beating to a bullet or a noose. Word of these sundown towns spread through black communities like a dire whisper. The United States in the early 1900s was still largely rural, and many black Americans lived in the South. But those who dared venture into other parts of the country quickly learned there were landscapes of hidden danger. Many all-white towns put up literal signposts at their borders, often emblazoned with messages so blunt they're shocking to modern eyes. Signs telling black people that if they remained in town after sundown, they might not live to see morning. In Mena, Arkansas, city leaders were so proud of their whites-only status that they advertised it on postcards, boasting, "Cool summers, mild winters, no blizzards, no Negroes." This blunt and racist slogan made clear that black people were not welcome in the community. In some communities, the warning took a less obvious but equally menacing form. A daily whistle or siren would sound in the evening to signal that all people of color needed to be out of town. These nightly rituals earned such places nicknames like Sunset Towns or Gray Towns. Everyone understood the real meaning. If you weren't white, stick around at your peril. Not only individual towns, but sometimes entire counties joined this wave of exclusion. By the 1930s, there were dozens of counties across various states that counted 0 black residents, a drastic change from just a generation before. Large stretches of the country became places where an African American family might drive for miles and encounter only communities where they could not safely stop for the night. It was a chilling inversion of the freedom promised after the Civil War. Instead of finding equality across the nation, Black Americans found themselves hemmed into certain areas, with vast swaths of America effectively off limits. Crucially, violence wasn't always necessary to keep a town all white. Cold economic and social pressure often did the job. If no one in town would hire, rent to, or serve Black people, they had little choice but to leave. A Black family that tried to stay would find life impossible, effectively starved out. White residents who dared to object or assist Black newcomers could face shunning or even threats themselves. The message from the community was brutally consistent: uphold the color line or suffer for breaking it. Other minorities were sometimes targeted too. Chinese immigrants chased out of Western mining camps, or signs barring Jewish and Mexican families in certain places. But the primary and most widespread targets were African Americans. By the 1920s, the notion of an all-white town was woven into the identity of these places. It was rarely written down, but everyone in town understood. Realtors refused to sell to Black buyers. Hotels turned away Black travelers. If a Black family did somehow move in, they would be harassed until they left or driven out by threats. White residents had grown accustomed to never seeing a Black neighbor. In these insulated bubbles, fear and prejudice thrived unchecked. This sweeping, coordinated whiting out of communities left a deep scar on the nation's map. Tens of thousands of Black Americans who might have lived in those towns were instead confined to crowded city neighborhoods or kept in the rural South, while entire stretches of the North and West became whites-only enclaves. The country was being segregated not only by explicit Jim Crow laws of the South, but by the very settlement patterns of towns and counties nationwide. For Black Americans, it meant learning to navigate around these sundown zones like minefields on the map, avoiding places where a stop for gas or a wrong turn could be life-threatening. For white residents in sundown towns, it became normal to go through life without ever interacting with a Black person as an equal, reinforcing ignorance and prejudice in generation after generation. By the mid-20th century, America was profoundly divided and segregated, not just in its big cities, but in its quiet little towns and suburbs as well. By the 1930s, the lines were clearly drawn. On one side, countless communities had erected invisible sundown barriers, congratulating themselves on being safe and all white. On the other side, Black Americans increasingly understood that large portions of their own country were no-go zones. The coming decades would test these boundaries as millions of Black families set out on journeys to find new homes and better lives. They would carry with them hope, determination, and the heavy knowledge that in many towns the setting sun still brought danger. A blue Buick rattles north along Highway 51 in the summer of 1937, loaded with everything a Black family from Mississippi owns. They are headed for Chicago, part of the Great Migration, chasing a chance at freedom and work in the North. But as dusk approaches, anxiety grips the parents. They know some towns up ahead are not safe for people like them after dark. They carry a Negro motorist green book, a guide listing a few safe places to eat or sleep. But the next friendly town is hours away. So they drive on. They skip dinner at a roadside cafe, eating cold fried chicken from a shoebox instead. When the sky turns black, they pull off the road to hide and rest, too afraid to stop in any unknown town. Through the long night, the father jolts awake at every passing car, heart pounding, until at last pale daylight arrives. Only then does the family resume their journey, relieved to have passed one more night unhurt on hostile ground. Countless Black families lived through journeys like this during the mid-20th century. The Great Migration, which began in the 1910s and accelerated through the 1940s, saw more than 6 million African Americans move out of the rural South. They were seeking economic opportunity and an escape from the oppression of Jim Crow segregation. Yet as they spread out across the nation, many discovered that bigotry had merely changed form. The blatantly racist laws of the South gave way to unwritten rules and sundown warnings elsewhere. Black newcomers to northern cities quickly learned to avoid certain surrounding suburbs and small towns that remained aggressively all white. Often a black worker could labor at a factory by day, but was expected to leave the white part of town by nightfall. If they lingered after dark in the wrong community, they risked police harassment or worse. This reality turned everyday acts of travel into meticulous exercises in planning and courage. Black churches, social clubs, and the black press circulated vital information about safe versus unsafe locales. By the 1930s, guides like the Green Book became essential. Victor H. Green, a black postal worker from Harlem, started publishing the Negro Motorist Green Book in 1936 to catalog hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and even private homes across America that welcome black patrons. It was born from the very real need to avoid humiliation, danger, or death on the open road. With a green book in hand, a black family driving cross-country could steer toward the next town that had, say, a black-owned boarding house, and away from the hostile towns where a wrong stop might end in violence. Still, even with these guides, the journeys were often stressful and perilous. Tires could blow out in a whites-only area. Then what? One might run low on gas and have to weigh the risks of stopping in a hostile town or rolling on fumes to the next safe haven. Many personal accounts describe the constant vigilance on those trips. One wrong turn or slow pit stop could mean trouble, so parents set strict rules. Don't use the bathroom or linger in a town that feels unsafe, and if a police car tails you, keep calm and hope for the best. The very cover of the Green Book carried a telling motto: carry your green book with you, you may need it. It was both a reassurance of refuge and a stark reminder of the dangers lurking on America's roads. The influx of black citizens into northern and western cities during this period did begin to chip away at some racial barriers, but it also exposed how deep the Sundown mentality ran outside the South. Many white residents of these regions had rarely interacted with black people except perhaps as porters on trains or janitors in the background. When black families moved into cities like Cleveland, Milwaukee, or Los Angeles, they often found themselves clustered in rundown districts because discriminatory housing covenants barred them from better neighborhoods. These covenants, legal agreements embedded in property deeds, forbade selling or renting homes to non-white buyers in many towns and suburbs. In effect, they turned entire residential areas into sundown zones without the need for crude signs. For instance, in the late 1940s, the builders of Levittown, a massive new suburb on Long Island, refused to sell homes to black veterans, effectively enforcing an all-white policy. All across the country, many suburban developments and small towns did the same. It meant that even as black Americans served and sacrificed in World War II, they returned to find themselves still barred from the American dream of a home in the suburbs if those communities decided to keep their doors closed. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the landscape of America's racial geography had been transformed and yet remained painfully the same. Millions of black Americans had moved to new regions, but in those new places, they were often funneled into segregated urban neighborhoods hemmed in by invisible walls. Sundown towns and suburbs still ringed many cities like guard posts of segregation. A black serviceman returning to Texas or Indiana in uniform could still be told by a town marshal, "Boy, you best not let sunset catch you here." The bitterness of that reality was not lost on the returning veterans and the younger generation who had glimpsed a broader world during the war. They had helped defeat fascism abroad, only to face vicious racism at home. In the coming years, black Americans and their allies would push those cracks open wide. The battle against sundown towns would shift from quiet acts of avoidance on back roads to open confrontation in courtrooms, at lunch counters, and on the streets. The civil rights movement was on the horizon, ready to challenge the racist underpinnings of American society that sundown towns epitomized. But the old order would not give up easily. As the 1950s began, many communities clung tightly to their all-white status, even as the nation as a whole was being forced to reckon with the hypocrisy of freedom for some and oppression for others. On a sweltering July night in 1951, thousands of white residents in Cicero, Illinois, surrounded an apartment building where a black family had just moved in. The mob smashed windows and heaved the family's furniture into the street, then set it ablaze. Cicero police stood by or even joined in. It took the Illinois National Guard to disperse the rioters and restore order. The black family fled and the point was made. Cicero, a suburb of Chicago, would remain a sundown town. In 1951, its all-white status was enforced not by a posted sign, but by a raging mob in full view of the nation. Scenes like this made it painfully clear that the end of World War II and the onset of the Cold War had not automatically broken the grip of America's racist past. If anything, the post-war era brought these conflicts into stark relief. The United States portrayed itself as the leader of the free world, yet on the ground in places like Cicero and countless other communities, freedom was still largely the property of white Americans only. However, from the mid-1950s through the 1960s, a growing civil rights movement would directly challenge segregation and racial violence. Bit by bit, the walls of the sundown town began to crack under legal and moral pressure. In 1954, the Supreme Court's landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision struck down racial segregation in public schools. That ruling sent shockwaves even through towns without any black residents, and some all-white communities reacted with panic. Rather than risk integration, a few doubled down on exclusion. One town in Arkansas even forced its black residents to move away rather than allow black and white children to attend school together. But these desperate measures could not hold back the coming push for equality. Yet, the tide of history was turning. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, civil rights activism was rising to challenge segregation in all its forms. Activists, black and white, began shining a light on the hidden strongholds of Jim Crow outside the South, including those sundown towns that Northern whites had long kept out of mind. This exposure came alongside changes in law. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, outlawing discrimination in public accommodations, meaning that hotels, diners, and theaters could no longer legally refuse service based on race. In practice, many sundown towns ignored the new law or found subtle ways around it, but overt whites-only signs gradually disappeared from storefronts across America. Then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was enacted, making it illegal to refuse to sell or rent housing due to race. On paper, the sundown town was now fully outlawed. In reality, these all-white towns did not magically open their doors overnight. Many simply became more quietly selective. Real estate agents continued steering black buyers away, or banks mysteriously denied loans for homes in certain neighborhoods. Tactics like redlining that continued the exclusion under a new guise. Some communities did face direct reckonings. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led marches against housing segregation in Chicago and was met with violent white mobs. Proof that sundown town attitudes were not confined to small towns or the South. Nevertheless, progress came. The combination of new laws, court orders, and changing public opinion slowly began to pry open some of these closed communities. By the 1970s, a few black families were moving into places that had been whites only for generations, sometimes under the protection of court rulings or federal housing programs. These pioneers often endured hostility, slashed tires, broken windows, cold stares at the grocery store, but their presence proved that the grip of the sundown town could be loosened. And yet, many sundown towns remained virtually untouched by integration even as late as the 1970s and 1980s. Places that were remote or small enough to escape scrutiny held onto their old ways. In some, white supremacist groups openly operated. Harrison, Arkansas, site of the 1905 expulsions, hosted KKK organizations well into the 1980s, even advertising them on local billboards. Elsewhere, a sundown town's nasty reputation alone kept black people away, often reinforced by sporadic violence. Occasional violent attacks in these towns, even as late as the 1960s, reminded everyone that the sundown threat was still very real. Perhaps the most dramatic confrontation with the legacy of a sundown community came in 1987 in Forsyth County, Georgia. Forsyth, the same county that had expelled its black population in 1912, still had almost no black residents 75 years later. Civil rights activists, led by Hosea Williams, organized a Brotherhood March into Forsyth County to call attention to this stark example of enduring segregation. In January of 1987, a small interracial march through Forsyth was attacked by hundreds of angry white counter-protesters. They waved Confederate flags, screamed slurs, and hurled rocks and bottles at the marchers' heads. Cars were smashed, people were injured. Television footage of the melee, snarling teenagers in trucker caps throwing bricks at peaceful demonstrators, looked like something from the 1960s civil rights era rather than a suburb of Atlanta in 1987. A week later, a second march of nearly 20,000 people, this time flanked by rows of state troopers, managed to proceed peacefully through Forsyth County as stunned locals looked on. The confrontation forced Forsyth County to confront its racist reputation under the glare of national media. Slowly, in the aftermath, a few black individuals began to live and work in Forsyth, but the county's population remained overwhelmingly white well into the 1990s. The spectacle of an all-white county in the late 20th century violently defending its whiteness was a national wake-up call. Sundown towns were not just ancient history. By the end of the 1980s, the legal structures upholding whites-only towns had been dismantled, but attitudes and demographics were slower to change. Some towns slowly began to reckon with their history. A few even issued public apologies or invited black speakers to town events, while others stayed silent and unmoved. But whether acknowledged or not, the Sundown town left a deep imprint on America's landscape and psyche. Even as the United States has grown more diverse and openly condemns the racism of the past, the shadow of sundown towns still stretches over the present day. In fact, sundown towns, or their modern equivalents, still exist today. Most white Americans continue to live in communities that are almost entirely white, whether by lingering reputation, economic exclusion, or simple inertia. The overt sundown signs and ordinances may be gone, but in many places the message persists in unspoken form. One can drive through county after county in parts of this country and rarely see a black face, not because black Americans are legally barred, but because history and intimidation have done their work. Some of these towns have begun, however haltingly, to acknowledge their past. It is explained by assets like homes, land, businesses, and inheritances. White families disproportionately benefited from land ownership that appreciated over generations. Black families, having been denied or dispossessed of land, were largely locked out of that accumulation. Home ownership reflects this history directly. Federal housing policies in the mid-20th century subsidized white home ownership through federally backed mortgages while excluding black neighborhoods through redlining. The result is that homes owned by white families were more likely to increase in value and be passed down. Black families were more likely to rent, live in undervalued areas, or lose property through predatory contracts. That pattern persists. Property values in historically black neighborhoods remain lower, not because of lack of care or effort, but because of decades of disinvestment rooted in earlier land exclusion. Education is shaped by the same foundation. In much of the United States, public schools are funded by local property taxes. Communities with higher land values fund better resourced schools. Communities that were stripped of land and wealth fund under-resourced ones. The gap in school quality, facilities, class sizes, and extracurricular opportunities follows the map of historical dispossession almost exactly. Employment outcomes are also affected. Land ownership once allowed families to weather economic downturns, invest in education, start businesses, or relocate for opportunity. Without that buffer, economic shocks hit harder. Job loss becomes crisis instead of setback. Medical emergencies become debt, and generational recovery becomes impossible. Health disparities follow the same lines. Neighborhoods shaped by historic land theft are more likely to face environmental hazards, food deserts, inadequate healthcare access, and housing insecurity. All of these are not lifestyle choices. They are geographic outcomes produced by who was allowed to own land and who was not. Even political power is connected. Land ownership historically influenced voting access, local governance, and representation. When black communities were pushed off land and crowded into undervalued areas, their political leverage shrank. Decisions about zoning, infrastructure, and development were made without them and often against their interests. Modern battles over gerrymandering, voter access, and municipal neglect are extensions of this earlier displacement. Perhaps most damaging is the narrative that followed. Because the theft happened gradually, through laws, courts, contracts, and neutral policy, it was later forgotten and denied. Poverty was framed as a personal failure rather than a historical outcome. Responsibility was shifted from systems to individuals. This misunderstanding continues to shape public debate today. When conversations about inequality surface, they are often stripped of land history. Attention shifts to behavior, culture, or personal motivation, while inheritance, access, and removal are left unexamined. Without an understanding of land theft, poverty appears mysterious or self-inflicted. With that understanding, poverty becomes predictable. These effects are not confined to the past, nor are they limited to rural spaces. In cities across the country, Black communities continue to be displaced through gentrification, eminent domain, and speculative development. Property is taken, neighborhoods are erased, and compensation rarely reflects true value. The language has changed, the tools have evolved, but the direction remains the same. What we are living with now is not the aftermath of a single injustice, but the accumulation of many. Each generation denied land had less to pass on. Each generation forced to begin again fell further behind a system that rewards continuity, stability, and ownership. Wealth did not simply fail to reach Black communities, it was repeatedly extracted, redirected, and withheld. This is one of the most enduring ways history shapes the present, not through memory alone, but through material conditions that persist long after the original acts are forgotten or denied. Land determines who builds wealth, who secures housing, who borrows capital, who passes something on, and who is forced to start from nothing, again and again. And this is why Black poverty cannot be understood apart from land theft. Not because the past matters, symbolically, but because it still governs the present. It still decides who owns, who rents, who remains rooted, and who was pushed aside. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel as we continue uncovering the forgotten chapters of our shared history, documentaries of labor, resilience, and the people whose work helped build the world we live in today. Once again, thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video.